All right, well, good evening, everyone. And on behalf of the Village of Cary and the Board of Zoning, Planning, and Appeals, I'd like to hereby call this meeting to order on this Thursday, June the 16th, 2022, at 7 p.m. We have a quorum of members, and at this time, I'd like to ask Mr. Brian Simmons, our Director of Community Development, to please call the roll.
Williams?
Here.
Kretschmer?
Here.
Graziano?
Present.
Jasper?
Here.
Nats?
Here.
O'Laughlin?
Here.
Stefani? Corey?
Here. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, we invite you to rise with us for the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks very much, everyone.
No screen today. Oops, don't roll.
Yeah.
Sorry, let me do that.
So, gentlemen, there's only one petition here tonight, and so for the benefit of the petitioner, I'll try to step you through the way we do our work. And for those of you wondering why this gentleman to my right, your left, didn't acknowledge in the roll call, he's general counsel for the Village of Cary, and this is Mr. Euler. So the way we typically do our meetings here is that we ask Mr. Simmons to give us an overview of the case, and then members of the ZPA may have some questions for Mr. Simmons. Once we conclude that portion of the meeting, we'll turn it over to yourself, and you're welcome to add additional comments or color to the application that you think is appropriate. Once again, members of the ZPA may have some questions for yourself. Once we close that portion, we'll open up to the public. Now, obviously, we thought there would be some people here tonight. There are not, but we still will open it up to public and close it. I don't know if anyone will come in between now and then. It's not being live streamed, so we're not going to worry about that component tonight. And then once we close that part of the meeting, we bring it back in-house here. We may have some questions amongst ourselves as far as the application. We'll take a vote. I think the gentlemen know, like you know, it's kind of divided into two segments tonight. One is that text amendment that you've requested. The other is the conditional use and the variance request. We take a vote, and then that vote gets delivered back to our elected officials, and they become the final arbiter of a discussion tonight. So that's the process. So before we move forward, I just want to double check if that is okay with yourselves. That's the way we're going to kind of move forward tonight. Okay. So without further ado, I think we're going to call village case number 22, ZPA 05003, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Simmons for an overview.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As mentioned, this request is for a proposed cannabis dispensary at 20 Northwest Highway. There are three actions that the petitioners are requesting approval for this evening. But first, just to go briefly give an overview of the property. The site right now is zoned B3R, which is our fringe business residential district. And the petitioner this evening is requesting approvals, again, for three items, which include a text amendment that would allow cannabis dispensaries as a conditional use within the zoning district. Currently, the use is not allowed within this district. And then if that text amendment is supported, they're seeking approval of a conditional use for the proposed operation of a cannabis dispensary here, and then also a variance to the required screen requirements for the shared property line with the residential area to the south. Brief overview of the history of the property. This property is part of the original corporate limits of the village back in 1893. The existing building was constructed in the 1940s and eventually was zoned R2 following the construction of that property. In 1969, the property was rezoned to B2 general business and then was subject to two village-initiated rezonings of the property. First in 1998 when the village did a comprehensive update to our zoning regulations and a map update. The property was rezoned to the B3 Fringe Business District at that time. And then in 2003, following the creation of the B3R district, this property was rezoned to that zoning classification at that time period. In 2007, the petitioner or the property received approval for a sign variance for the existing monument sign that's in the front of the property for a 12-foot tall sign which has a 1-foot setback. Just a brief overview, a reminder of the history regarding cannabis uses. The state of Illinois, approximately 3 years ago, passed the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act, which allowed businesses to sell and produce cannabis products within the state of Illinois. That act allowed municipalities to adopt zoning regulations related to the placement of the uses within their jurisdiction. And later that year, the village did adopt regulations under Ordinance 1911-02 that specified where within the village of Cary dispensaries, craft growers, and cultivation centers could be located. Specifically, the zoning requirements that were established what districts the uses could go into, which were currently our code reflects what was approved, includes the B2 district, the B3 district, and the M district are permitted locations for dispensaries. And then the cultivation centers, craft growers, and infusers were conditional uses within our industrial zones. This is the M district. For operating a business, there are certain requirements that the cannabis dispensary is required to adhere to for the state. Specifically, they have to obtain a license through the state in order to sell the products. They cannot sell or distribute cannabis to anyone who's under the age of 21. The product must be sold in a container or packaged with specific labeling requirements that would be dictated by the state. They can have or need to have at least 2 employees working at any time in order to conduct sales from the facility. So if there's less than 2 employees, the facility would not be permitted to provide any retail operations from their property. And then there are certain requirements as well with video surveillance of the facility. It needs to be under 24 constant surveillance, and if that surveillance goes down, the sales will be prohibited from that location. Within the Village of Cary, we have various standards or requirements that were established for cannabis uses within the village, and I'll go through those conditions that are in the staff report as well, and how they reply to this proposed petition. Specifically, there's the first item is a fixed location is required. It has to be properly licensed facility, and then all operations need to be conducted within an enclosed building. Second condition is regarding the location of the use. As mentioned, dispensaries are permitted uses within the B2, B3, and M zoning districts currently. The petitioner, with the subject property being zone B3R, is proposing to amend the code to allow dispensaries as a conditional use within the B3R district. Further, there are separation requirements for the use from other sensitive land uses. Specifically, there's a 1,000-foot requirement, buffer requirement from any church, daycare, or school. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the closest facilities to this property, which include the Foundation Baptist Church, which is roughly 1,900 feet to the southwest, and then the Oak Knoll Early Childhood Center, which again is 1,900 feet to the north of the property. So it would be located outside of that 1,000-foot range. And then another requirement that the village has is that a dispensary, proposed dispensary location cannot be located within 15 feet of an existing dispensary, which, as the village does not have an existing dispensary in the community, that does not apply to this application as well. Other conditions include a restriction on dispensaries located within residential districts, which not apply to this petition as a business district is proposed. There are site lighting and security requirements for the use as far as the operation of the property, and screening from adjacent uses. The code requires a buffer yard to any sensitive or detached single-family residential uses. Per the code, a 15-foot buffer would be required, which is a Type C transition area, including landscape materials, and a 6-foot fence. As part of the petition this evening, the petitioner is asking for a variance to that standard to basically maintain the status quo of the existing transition yard that's adjacent to the residential properties to the south, and I have additional information on that further in the presentation here as well. Item 6 is the use has to have access and visibility from a roadway. This property has direct access to Northwest Highway, so it would comply with those requirements as well. And then there are specific requirements as far as how they can advertise the business with signage for the state's regulations, but also they need to comply with the village's UDO requirements for any signs that are proposed on the property. The petition this evening did not provide additional information for the types of signs that would be proposed for the site. The final 4 conditions that are within the code for the operation of a cannabis use include the hours of operation. Our code allows dispensaries to operate between the hours of 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. As proposed, the petitioners seeking to operate for a 12-hour time period between 10 a.m. and 10 p.m., so they would comply with those time requirements. They're proposing to employ a total of 10 to 12 individuals at the property, plus security, so they can provide additional information as far as how the shifts may work or how many of those employees will be on site at any one time. Again, sales will be performed within the structure as required, and then the only operation that will be conformed on this property would be retail sales with ancillary infusion processes proposed. There would be no growing, production, or other consumption permitted on the property should the use be approved at this location. Just briefly reviewing the proposed improvements, the petitioners, as the site plan, you can see here, there are some slight modifications proposed to the site. Basically, that would potentially entail additional landscaping materials will be added both at the foundation of the building along Northwest Highway and then at the shared property line with the residential properties to the south, which actually is on the left-hand side of your screen here. So there will be some additional plantings that will be added in addition to plantings that are located in that facility or that area of the property right now. This is just an image that would show the rendering of existing trees and proposed landscaping that would be added to the property on the east side of the property. Additional improvements would be updating to certain facade elements. The petitioner is proposing to modify the facade and can provide some additional information as far as how they propose to improve the property, but essentially there's a slight facelift to the existing building and then also interior renovations to gut the building and provide a floor plan that's conducive for the proposed operation of retail sales. As part of the petition, the petitioner did provide a traffic impact study at the request of staff just to verify how the proposed use would potentially impact the adjacent roadway network with the proximity to the signal at East Main Street and then with being on Route 14. That information was in your packet and then also reviewed from a parking standpoint how the use complies with our code for retail uses. We do not have a specific requirement for cannabis dispensaries within the code, so our general retail parking requirement would apply, which is 1 space per 250 gross square feet. As applying the code, that would require a minimum of 15 spaces be provided in the property, and there are existing 17 spaces. So the site, as currently existing, exceeds our code by 2 spaces. So there's no relief required for parking at this point. As with any decision that the village makes, we refer to our land use documents for guidance as far as long-term planning decisions. Specifically for the comprehensive plan, the site is designated as commercial in the comprehensive plan, which is appropriate for commercial uses, which provide for the day-to-day retail and service needs of the village. This subject property is also part of the Downtown Cary Strategic Plan planning area, which was adopted last year. And that plan recommends that the village prioritize active commercial uses within the downtown core that allow people to linger longer both during the day and evening, and specifically calls out food service, drinking places, retail, arts, and health and wellness land uses. It should be noted that this site is actually on the edge of that planning area for the downtown plan, so it's from the both the zoning designation and also the jurisdiction as far as where it is from the downtown area. It is on the fringe area of basically the eastern edge of what we would consider potentially the downtown. Specifically going into the request that the petitioner is seeking approval for, the first item up for review is a text amendment to modify the UDO to allow dispensaries as a conditional use within the B3R district. So as proposed on the slide, you can see is the proposal to modify the table of permitted uses, which would add the C in the B3R column for cannabis dispensaries, so that any B3R property within the village would be able to potentially have a cannabis dispensary should that text amendment be changed. This slide shows the impact of potential, what our current regulations are for cannabis dispensaries or cannabis uses, and where the subject property falls within. So if the image that's on the left of your slide shows the zoning districts where dispensaries currently are permitted within the village, so the B2, B3, and the M districts are where it's permitted. So in the map, you can see properties that are zoned, those designations that would be permissible for a dispensary to locate in by right as of today. The yellow areas that are added to that show the buffers, the 1,000-foot buffer that would be located around any church or school, which is existing within the community. So if a property were to be zoned, if you're looking specifically, for example, the municipal center, which we're currently in right now, is located in this portion with the Goddard School directly across the street. No dispensary would be allowed to locate within 1,000 feet of that area. So even though this property in this area would be permissible for dispensary to locate in from a zoning perspective, due to the proximity to that school use, they would not be allowed to locate on that property. So any area that's not, in this map, any area that is colored either pink, red, or purple, which is not covered by the yellow, would be a location where the use would be permitted. As part of the petitioner's proposal, they're proposing to add the B3R district as a potential location for dispensaries, again, allowing it to be as a conditional use. The B3R district is a few properties are zoned within the village, specifically the area that's on Northwest Highway between the ComEd tension power lines to the east and the intersection with East Main Street to this intersection with First Street. It's about a 2-block distance of properties that front on the Northwest Highway are zone B3R. It was a district that was created again back in 2003 that was designed to saw this area as kind of a more historical area, has a lot of houses that were built turn of the century, kind of 1900s to 1940s time period, had some unique architectural elements that the village wanted to maintain, and then also wanted to restrict certain uses from going within that area, so that it was more restrictive than the existing B3 district is. So this area is the largest area that is zoned B3R. It's shown in the image on the right. There are 2 other properties that are in the village that are also zoned B3R, which are at the entrance to the Trout Valley subdivision of the village. There is a property which is commonly referred to as the Two Penny Farm property, which is located, as you can see my cursor, right opposite the entrance of Trout Valley subdivision. That is also zone B3R and would be out of the separation requirements for an existing school or church use. And then the other property, which is zone B3R, is the Country Common Shopping Center, which would fall within an existing 1,000 feet of an area. So if a text amendment were to be approved for allowing the use within this district, eventually it would also apply to the Two Penny Farm properties, another property that potentially could have a dispensary located within it under this proposed text amendment. As with any standards or proposals that are submitted, there are certain standards that are identified within the Unified Development Ordinance that need to be considered. The petitioners provided a response to those standards, but essentially the proposed amendment is not detrimental to the orderly development of the village. Amendment shall not be detrimental to endanger the public health, safety, and general welfare, and the proposed amendment promotes the public interest and not solely the interest of the applicant. Moving forward, the second request is a request for a conditional use for this facility. So obviously, if the text amendment is supported, the petitioner would like to receive approval for the operation of their business at this location. There would be basically, for the conditional use, they would be required to comply with the state of Illinois requirements for the operation of a cannabis dispensary, and also would be required to comply with the village's UDO regulations as specified earlier. So the 12 or 11 conditions that are in the UDO would be responsible to apply to those conditions. Similarly, there are standards that are established in the code for conditional uses. The petitioners provide a response to those standards as well, and they can provide additional testimony for how they believe their proposed petition complies with those standards. Finally, the last item for review or request from the petitioner is seeking a variation for the transition area to the south property line. As highlighted in the slide, the required buffer is 15 feet from a landscape area that needs to be provided between the proposed use and an adjacent single-family residential use. Per the code, there would be a requirement for 14 trees and 36 shrubs for the entire property line, along with a 6-foot fence. The proposal, as the petitioner can provide information for, is they're proposing to maintain the existing 3-foot buffer, which exists in the property. Due to the age of the property and when it was developed, there's the existing buffer yard from the area doesn't lend itself to provide the full 15 feet. However, they are planning to provide additional 6-foot fence along the parking lot area to provide additional screening, plus 7 additional plantings, trees that can provide additional screening from the proposed use to the adjacent single-family homes. Similar to a text amendment and conditional use, there are various standards that need to be met for a variation, specifically looking at if there's a hardship was caused by unique circumstances relating to the land and not the general conditions of the district. Applicant's not taking any action that has caused the extraordinary condition, made it substantially worse than otherwise might have been, and the relief proposed will not alter the character of the locality. For this evening, staff is recommending that there's 2 motions that be made in this case. As far as first would be to review the proposed text amendment and possibly vote on that separately to determine if proposed changes to the Unified Development Ordinance are warranted or meet the standards. And then secondly, would recommend approval of a motion to grant a conditional use and variance for the proposed cannabis dispensary. So should the ZPA determine that the various standards have been met in this case, staff would recommend approval of both the motions as described on the slide, subject to both the conditions in the staff report and then the text amendments as detailed in the staff report. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have, and then the petitioner's here to provide additional testimony for their petition as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simmons, and I know the packet was rather comprehensive. So, gentlemen, questions for Mr. Simmons? Mr. Jasper.
If I may, if we can go back to the properties on Cary Algonquin, the other B3R properties, it seems as though most of that area is blocked out by a church school buffer, except towards the end. I'm trying to visualize what end of the property that is. Is that shopping center that's there, or is it the house that's there?
It's the house that's there. So the shopping center, just for example, is zoned B3 now, so you can see that area is colored underneath the yellows. Okay, sorry. So the property that is zoned B3R, just for reference, there's a white parcel that's kind of right between these 2 circles. That's the Tufeni Farm. It's an old farmhouse.
So that would require construction of a building in order to. My point is, if we do a conditional, if we do this, if we add this conditional use to the B3R, and it's okay for this particular lot. The only other potential lot seems to be, that lot on Cary Algonquin Road. And if we look at it, there's really nothing there in which to put any kind of business.
Not necessarily. So the property that's there now, that other property, and it's just for comparison as far as what the B3R district. So if we approve a text amendment that allows it within the B3R district, any property that's on the right-hand side here that's owned B3R potentially could have a dispensary. But if this one's approved at this location, that the buffer yard requirement would basically eliminate another dispensary locating within that eastern B3R district on Route 14. So,
Yeah, no, I understand
Right.
that. I'm just saying.
But the other
you know,
property-
If we do,
yeah.
if we take a look at another B3R,
Mhm.
you know, what's the probability of another conditional use request coming through?
yeah, I can't say it's not possible, but certainly that building right now is used as an office building.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
again, it could be.
when we talked about it, I thought you might be talking about the shopping center. And if I recall, somewhere in here, it said something about the fact that state law doesn't let you put a dispensary in a shopping center. But if that shopping center is just B3.
Correct, the shopping center where the 7-Eleven's located, that's B3.
Okay,
The Two Penny Farm property, it's a two-story
Right.
old farmhouse. It does have parking behind it, but if this text amendment were approved, that one is zone B3R.
but within the village, the one we're talking about tonight and that particular location are the only two locations within the village of Cary that could potentially qualify for a conditional use for cannabis dispensary and infusion.
Correct, within the B3R district. There are.
Yeah,
all the
no,
other
I
properties.
understand, and that's
Okay.
there, and that's, you know.
There are other
But-
areas
Right.
where it's allowable.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Mhm.
Okay. My other concern in looking at this, and I'm just curious as to if anybody else within the village looked at this, is the traffic pattern. You know, there's essentially, well,
And I tried to get through it, and I'm with you.
well,
The
yeah,
traffic
but,
study.
I mean, but that doesn't, I went
didn't
through
have a
that, and it
problem
doesn't
with it.
address.
I know you, that was going to be my question to
Well,
you.
that's why I said if anybody else. So I'm just raising the question and I'll let the professionals answer. But my concern is that there is, the left-hand turn across traffic is just not very clean. And I'm not a traffic professional, and if the traffic professionals think that that's acceptable, then I don't have a problem with it. But I just, you know, my intuition when I look at it is, oh, there's a thin part of the funnel. So,
Maybe, Mr. Jasper, if I can offer a comment around this, is that I'm sure the petitioner is going to be well-versed in that traffic study.
right, but I'm talking about the village of Cary. What's the
Yeah.
police
Yeah.
chief say about it? What's the village engineer say about it?
We did-
What does Commissioner Graziano say? Yeah.
Yeah, certainly,
So-
the traffic study was reviewed, but we had both police and public works reviewed it. We did provide comments back to the petitioner on the initial study that was provided. They did make some changes to it as well. We did not have any objections to what was presented within it from a standpoint. I understand the concerns just from the proximity to the intersection, and then the concern is if you have somebody turning left into this property, they're blocking a through lane on Route 14. It is an existing condition that's been there for,
Yep.
you know, since 14's been widened for 25 years.
Yep.
So,
Highly unrealistic. We take over ComEd's lot and make that a four-way intersection, and they can turn in off of whatever, but I know that's unrealistic, so we won't even go there. So, okay, so the village,
it was.
you've answered my question.
Okay.
The rest I'll save for later.
Okay. So, gentlemen, before we move forward with the petitioner, any other questions for Mr. Simmons?
Mine was just the same comment, I know what the traffic study kind of says. I know James knows it way better than I do, but that's a suicide curve, as we like to call it. And I was just making sure that the same thing, that everybody's reviewed it, because that's a dangerous curve to begin with. So,
My only comment, took care of the one question I had, that the 1,500 feet would basically encompass all the rest of the B3R area down there, and the B3 and the B2, basically. And my only comment with regard to the traffic study was, I was surprised that they didn't recommend right in, right out only.
Yeah.
Or right in, no left turn in. You could do a right in, a right and left out is another variation. But if police and Eric and everybody agrees with them, just because they used the wrong company, that's.
Mr. Nats, did you have a question?
Yes. Clarification, is it a state statute that they have 24-hour surveillance and/or security, or one or the other?
Both, yeah. You can provide more information as far as the state requirements for it, but I believe it has to be, it's under constant surveillance, and they have to have somebody on the property 24 hours.
Other questions, gentlemen, for Mr. Simmons? So, Mr. Simmons, I've got a couple for you. The first one is, so we're being transparent in the process. I think all the members, maybe save one, and Mr. Nance, I'm thinking of yourself, when we did the review of the UDO, I don't think you were on the committee when we were kind of going through and stepping through the process. So perhaps just to be transparent here, Mr. Simmons, if we could take everybody through, that process, and then were any adjustments made to that document called the UDO, Unified Development Ordinance, after it was approved?
Sure. Yeah, I think from the history from the UDO, we adopted the UDO in summer of 2019. The Village of Cary did. So that was a comprehensive rewrite of our zoning regulations for the village that we made various changes. Creation of the R2A district was one of them, as you can see in the slide. So there were changes that we made to the code to reflect the type of development that the village wanted to see. And at the time that we adopted that regulation, or the code in 2019, the state passed the Cannabis Act for allowing the uses within the state. So we reviewed how we wanted to treat the use locally, and then basically, similar to what's proposed this evening, proposed a text amendment to modify the code for those specific uses. So the overall UDO was approved, I think, May of 2019, and by November, we had proposed an amendment to modify it further to add the proposed requirements for cannabis uses. And since the time period that we've approved the UDO, I think we've done 2 or 3 other text amendments to modify it as well. So it's a fluid process. Sometimes the village proposes text amendments to reflect the type of development we want to see. Other times there are petitions that come forward that the code didn't think of or didn't have or contemplate. So a petitioner can propose a text amendment as well, provided they meet the standards, and we can review that also.
Thank you, Mr. Simmons. And then, Mr. O'Loughlin, I thought you would glom onto this question, but I think I should ask Mr. Simmons. Obviously, there was notification sent out to the residences that abut this property.
I was going to wait for the petitioner.
All right, well, you can ask again.
No, you go.
So the question would be, Mr. Simmons, did you receive any feedback whatsoever from anyone that was notified?
The village did not.
Okay, very good. Okay, thank you. So, gentlemen, unless there's other questions from the committee, I think we'll turn it over to the petitioner. So I don't know.
Just a comment, when we were doing the UDO, or the cannabis thing, we had a lot of discussion about where it could be located and that.
Yes, we did.
And I think everybody didn't know at that time, where was a good spot, where was not a good spot. Do we want something near the train station? And I think from what my just personal observations is I really haven't heard any problems with City of Chicago or any place else that has them in a quote-unquote downtown type area. So just my observations.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Graziano. All right, so with that said, just double checking with the committee, no other questions, so we'll turn it over to the petitioner. So I don't know if it's yourself, Mr. Smith, or Mr. Ryan's going to speak. So-
Ed, this is Anthony Ryan and Michael Ryan,
Very good.
property owner and development director for the petitioner. Brian's done a fantastic job of summarizing, and so I think there's just a couple of things I would like to add and perhaps answer some questions that were asked that I think required a little clarification. First, for Commissioner Jasper, it isn't state law that says we can't locate in a shopping center. It's really more a function of what's called a reciprocal easement and operating
Okay,
agreement.
yep.
An agreement among the various owners, or sometimes developer and owners of a shopping center that says you can or cannot do this. This is slowly changing right now, where landlords and tenants are slowly changing REOAs, but it's like Ma Bell. They're old and very difficult to change, particularly if you have an anchor tenant that's a national credit tenant. So for instance, Jewel Osco would almost certainly never agree to any amendment in a shopping center that they're in. Partly just because it's an unknown, and partly because there's a component of this use which is a health and wellness use, right? And Osco doesn't want competition for health and wellness in the front of the parking lot. So that kind of backs me into an issue we had in Cary, which is when you look at the entirety of properties that are available in B2 and B3, and frankly factoring out a third of the Route 14 corridor, which is really the right-of-way for the railroad on one side, you're left with kind of very few locations you can possibly go into. And once we surveyed locations that were inline spaces or outlot spaces subject to an REA, we ended up with nothing. We ended up with a couple of areas of vacant land that you could potentially build on. Kind of gets me to my second point. We raised this in the petition, in the standards. We are in a transition period in this industry where 38 states and the District of Columbia have legalized cannabis use, but it is still a scheduled drug, and still, because of that, there are banking and title and land constraints that virtually prohibit you from building a single purpose structure on vacant land for the purposes of operating a dispensary. You can't get conventional financing of any sort, and to the extent you could get financing from a private source, you can't get title insurance or construction lien clearance because title insurance companies can't deal with this because of their regulations. So we end up with existing spaces that can be leased out, and that is true everywhere. It's true in Crystal Lake, it's true in Lake in the Hills, definitely true in Cary. That will change over time. We're all certain of that, and there may be a day in the future, as the question came up, is there another site on the other end of town that might be appropriate for dispensary? And the answer is maybe someday, and maybe someday not too many years in the future, if the SAFE Act is passed, right, and banks can start offering some form of financing for construction, new development, and title companies will start allowing that process to happen. In the meantime, all we can do is find an existing space with a landlord who's willing to invest substantial dollars into a facility that's going to require more security than in probably any place else in the village. And in this case, something that requires an entire facelift of the facade of the property, which probably looked perfectly appropriate back when it was a dog food meat processing plant and horses came in the back and dog food came out the front, but not so much in today's standards. So I have a little bit of experience with the zoning. Anthony this is his 5th dispensary in 4 states and has a lot of technical information about operational matters, which you might be interested in for purposes of the conditional use. So all things considered, since Brian's presentation was comprehensive, I think I would like to answer any questions you have at this time, and then reserve in case there's something we need to add to add some context to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Gentlemen, questions for Mr. Smith?
Sure.
Mr. Jasper?
And you mentioned the thoroughness of your security. Most of it seems to be electronic. cameras, those kind of things. Any physical, human security on premises?
Yeah, so when you, this is, for anybody who's not been in a dispensary, this is, if you walked in the door, this would not seem like a head shop, this would seem like the Apple store, with one exception, and that is that the vestibule is secured off from the rest of the facility. And to make it beyond the vestibule, you first interact with a security guard who validates your credentials, right? So are you even old enough to be in the shop, okay? In addition, they play a little bit of a flow purpose in that each person who comes into the actual sales facility is matched one-on-one with an employee. So if, for instance, on an off-peak time, you had a manager, a security guard, and 3 salespersons, you wouldn't allow 4 people in there. Not quite how it works. So it's a one-on-one consultation. So that waiting area in the front of the security is where they would stay.
What wasn't clear was if that person was a trained security officer?
Absolutely. So they are licensed security officers, and it'll be independently contracted. The same company will provide front security and the 24-hour physical, personal security, which is separate from the electronic security, which is from a different vendor.
Are they armed?
That's a good question. Are they armed?
We haven't crossed that bridge yet as far as whether or not, they have a gun that is an option. And in my other facilities, they are armed. But it's not a state mandate to be armed.
Okay. All righty.
And that-
Do you allow customers to be
No,
armed?
Oh, no.
That's definitely prohibited, and there's signage for no firearms on the
Okay.
premise.
All right, okay. Does the village have a opinion towards that? The security guard being armed or not armed?
We don't, with the code, we would defer to the state requirements for that.
Okay. All right. Just out of curiosity, this is, as you said, a cash business. So, you have a much higher than normal chance for robbery of any other business in the area. So how do you address that?
Would you like to answer that question?
Sure.
So gentlemen, just so there's no confusion, I should have said this in the early part of the meeting, this gets recorded. I don't know if you're aware of that. So when you come up to the podium, if you just kindly state your name and address so that we know who's on the record here. Thank you very much.
My name's Anthony Ryan. I'm the Director of Development for Vertical Management. My address is 708 East Main Street Road, Cary, Illinois. As far as the cash concern, as far as making sure that that's secured in our other facilities, and what we intend to do here is see to it that cash that is on site is secured within a block reinforced room that has biometric control access, locked within a TL30, which is pretty much the most robust locking safe that you could acquire, and 24/7 monitoring. You've got the panic buttons, you've got the alarm systems, you've got the video surveillance, you've got physical security on site. So it's kind of a multifaceted approach, combining all of
But
that.
I'm sure vertical management wants their cash.
Yeah, and actually, that's actually a good point.
How do you
And so-
get it out of the
So let me speak to that. So also, as far as Pat mentioning that cash is a big struggle in the industry, vertical management is actually one of the few, probably less than 5%, that actually do have full, transparent cannabis banking services with an Illinois bank. And so as far as yes, it will be heavy in cash. Cash will come in. At the same time that cash is getting picked up, typically that's a twice-a-week type of pickup from a Blue Line Protection Group, where they're taking that cash and they are depositing it into our banking institution. Which will take place here. So as much as, yes, customers will come in, they will be transacting with cash. That cash will be secured with a TL30, which, like I said, is the most advanced safe you could purchase. That's within a block CMU reinforced accounting room. There's restricted access where it's just going to be my accountant. And, everything's checks and balances as far as seed to sale tracking. Our QuickBooks has to match up to our BioTrack THC, that's all verified by our accounting agency and double-checked by our tax attorney, so the money's a big, big deal, very much so protected on multiple layers.
Will you guys allow debit card?
So in the retail environment, yes, that is typical integration to the retail platform. But at the same time, it's still, there's still a lot of customers that prefer just to transact with cash. Credit cards, like standard credit cards, no, but debit cards you do utilize within the retail environment. Yeah, and there will also be ATMs for customers if they prefer to pull out cash.
How many employees during a regular shift?
During a regular shift, between 5 to 6.
Okay, and they each show up separately. So that's, just say, 11 to 12 parking spaces left. Is that going to be enough for your customers? How many customers do you generally have at your rush, at your peak
Yeah,
period?
go ahead, Pat. I'll hand it off to Pat to talk a little bit more of the technical stuff.
We actually anticipated this. Thank you. And again, I will state for the record, since I didn't last time, my name is Patrick Smith, counsel for the petitioner. So we have a memorandum of understanding in place with the lodge, which is on the other side of the ComEd right-of-way for employee parking. And we are just waiting to sign that parking agreement with them based on the outcome of this process. We don't anticipate needing the extra space. The typical site visit is about 15 to 17 minutes. So there's, even though we may have a pretty steady stream during the busy times, there's not a lot of 40-minute at the Jewel, 50-minute at the Jewel kind of parking. Nevertheless, we need to accommodate spaces and convenience as much as possible. So by moving the employees across the right-of-way, we've kind of made provisions for that.
Okay. Last question? Sorry. Your business hours. You chose 10 to 10, which is the village, within the ordinance as well. And I presume that's why you chose it, because that's where we guided you. But, within 10 miles of here, no other cannabis shop stays open later than 8 o'clock.
Mhm.
Are you married to the 10 to 10?
That's an excellent question from a sales perspective. This is because it's a case of first impression here, kind of in Illinois for us, right?
Mm-hmm.
The operational hours, it's sort of like a wait and see. We know when the thrust is going to be,
Yeah,
right?
well,
We knew it wasn't going to be between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m.
You chose it because we put it out there for you. I'm just.
Well, there's an ancillary purpose from traffic perspective too, right? Because the before 9:30 a.m., the heaviest flow on Route 14 is eastbound, right, and not westbound. But after 9:30, it becomes relatively quiet, right? And so there's a benefit traffic-wise as well for those hours in the morning. That's certainly something that I think they could consider if you thought that 10 p.m. was too late. Although I would say that. Just off the top of my head, I would imagine like a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 8 o'clock would be relatively early.
Well, like
Even
I
in
said,
the
you
traditional
got, you
alcohol
have to go,
sales
you
establishment.
have to go well into
normally would
Cook
be-
County or
yeah.
well down into towards Elgin to get to the later hours. Anything in Lake, McHenry, and
Yep. We are all just figuring it out as we go. Absolutely.
okay, I'm done.
Thank you, Mr. Jasper. Gentlemen, other questions? Mr. Nance?
I think you cited that your residence is in Cary, so perhaps that's part of your response, but how did you come to select Cary in this particular, well, I understand the particular site, but how did you come to select Cary, and did you do a market study that helped you make that decision?
Well, personally, I was born and raised out here. Went to Cary Grove High School, went to Fox River Grove. I have 4 other siblings that went to Cary Grove. My father went to Cary Grove, and so this is where I grew up. It just so happens that after I went to college here in Illinois, Western Illinois, after I graduated with my bachelor's, I went and got my master's, and I personally won a couple licenses in Arizona. So fresh out of college, I went out there and I got thrown into the lion's den to kind of learn it all from scratch: design, build, funding, structuring. And since I've gained a lot of experience on a national level to do what I do. I currently own the multiple operations in multiple states, and Cary seemed like a good opportunity to bring an opportunity to my own hometown that I personally feel does a lot of good for the community. Brings jobs, brings tax revenue, and I would love to do that. This is where I'm from. This is where my roots are. I feel like I'm pretty well tied in with the community, not with just myself, but friends, family, grandfathers from out here, many generations, and so I feel like it's something that could be honestly a plus for our community. And so that's why I wanted to bring it here.
Thank you. Then my second question is the one-on-one consultations. I did read that, and I think it was stated earlier that the reason for that is education. Is that your business philosophy, or is that, again, some sort of state requirement? Or if you could elaborate on that.
Sure. It's more so business philosophy. I mean, you do have certain state regulations around, having educational material accessible for the consumer to, whether it's methods of administration or dosing or things like that. So, you do have that as like a compliance side to educate. But as far as like our motto, it comes down to customer service. You've got a lot of different layers of customers as far as like how educated they are on cannabis. And so we want to create a situation where that experience is facilitated and catered to, and you can consult with whomever it is, regardless of whether they're a part of the culture and they're very experienced, or they're a novice and they're maybe trying an alternative method of product. And so that's also apart from just quality customer service, it helps with the flow. It helps with getting them in, picking out something that's gonna meet their expectations, and sending them on their way, keeping that good flow. So it's a combination of all 3 of those.
Thank you. I do have one more, I'm sorry.
Sure.
You mentioned some of the positives of the business. What are some of the challenges that you've encountered as you've run these businesses?
Sure. Some of the challenges tend to revolve around a lot of the red tape and changing policy. I very much so am heavily involved on the start to finish of these things. So the zoning matters, the rules and regulations. The hardest thing, to be honest, in Illinois has been the tremendous amount of lawsuits and litigation and delays. And you've got people that, they're just trying to, start a business, and these delays are costly and they're difficult to overcome. We're at, just about over 2 years of delays that have finally come to an end, and the operator's in a position where they can get up and going. So that's from a challenge. That's been challenging, and then also educating people to kind of turn the stigma of cannabis. This is no longer a head shop where you're going in, there's people consuming the drug. This is big business, high-level professionalism. And so that's also been a challenge, because people just don't know. If you haven't been in a dispensary, you don't know what to expect. So helping change opinions.
Thank you.
What, if everything goes as planned, what is your timetable
Sure.
for that?
So as far as what I would like to do from this hearing, depending on how the landscape feels, is to submit for a full set of engineering construction permits to be approved in the next 30 days. With that, once we get through red lines and we've got a green light, we're doing demo and swinging hammers. And with that, we are pushing to be up and running within, say, 8 to 10 months, but we technically have 12 months to get up and running from the time that the state actually says go, which is expected to take place no later than July 22nd. So that's kind of where we sit right now.
Another question for the petitioner?
Just, we asked the question this way, I'll ask it this way. Did you guys get have you gotten any feedback from any of the neighbors that you notified?
No,
No.
no,
Okay.
no.
Please.
I-
Yeah. Mr. Graziano, did you have questions?
No, just looking at the plans here, I'm a little surprised that that forest of trees is not actually on your property.
Yeah,
So your buffer,
it's kind of already there.
yeah,
Yeah.
just, I look at the forest and I say, why do they need more trees? But we do have regulations.
Yeah.
We got to keep Brian in business.
Mr. Jasper, did you have another question?
Yeah, I have a couple more questions since they weren't asked. In here again, and I read this when I got it, and unfortunately, I didn't pick it up today before I came, so I can't tell where it's at or anything like that. But in here, it talked about the fact that there could be issues with delivery vehicles and customer vehicles within the parking lot. Have you thought about that any further?
Sure, Pat. Go ahead. I'll hand it over to
absolutely.
Pat.
Brian, would you mind pulling the site plan up for me? I apologize, I could not get the technology to work, wouldn't connect to late. So if you look at the upper left-hand side, you'll see the permeable
Right.
asphalt area. That actually won't go all the way back, it'll only go back as far as the meter. That's going to be used for the delivery corridor. There is a secure loading door in that section that is vestibuled on the inside as well, so we've got a double set of security there. So that's essentially all that area is going to be used for. So it's, in a sense, it's sort of segregated
Right.
from the customer parking area, right? It's a narrow area, excuse me, but that actually lends a little bit to the security because it's kind of hard to get around a vehicle to get back
Sure.
there from the customer parking area while you're doing the transport, which incidentally will be happening in off hours anyway.
So your deliveries of the infusion and of the product.
Yeah, it's a Prius. It's a small vehicle, because we're moving only small amounts of THC, right?
Oh.
And then small amounts of the batched food,
Okay.
so.
I thought you'd have a straight truck or something like that. I didn't expect a semi
No,
going in
it's,
there.
it's, no,
But,
it's a
okay.
relatively small vehicle.
All right, okay. And my last question is, one of the history of this was the 12-foot sign that we had up there, but it's gone, and I'm sure that it doesn't carry over from one tenant to the next. But what are your intentions as to signing?
So the state statute actually, and the regulations are very specific about what signage. In fact, the name of the facility will be, well, I like to say nondescript. In fact, I
We'll
told
know what
Brian
it
that
is.
actually walked into the Lake in the Hills facility because I thought it was a new breakfast place named Rise. That's how it looks. And frankly, that's kind of how it will come across here. I believe the sign was not a special use. I think it was a variation that ran with the property. So I'd anticipate the sign portion of it stays, but you can't utilize the announcement board portion of it because the state statute doesn't allow you to do that for cannabis dispensaries.
I can comment on the sign.
No, I think it was a variation, though. Yeah. Correct, when they
Correct.
lowered it was a variation.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the history, for the zoning history of the property in 2007, the sign was lowered, but there was a variation that was approved for the existing sign has a variation for where it's located at. It's 12 foot high and then also a foot off the property line. So the sign can remain as is. I don't think they're proposing any changes to this the sign as part of the petition. But obviously a face change to the sign is permissible under the code as long as they don't enlarge the sign or change any of the conditions of that variation approval.
And it will not be a changeable message.
No, you're not allowed to do that.
I'm really done.
All right. So, gentlemen, if no one has questions, I do have a few questions, Mr. Smith, and I'm not sure to address it with you, but in your testimony, you mentioned 4 states, 5 locations. And my first question around that is that in your experience with, I don't know if you've been counsel for the petitioner in the other locations.
I haven't in, yes, distinct capacities.
Okay. So the question is, have you found yourself in a similar circumstance like you're here tonight requesting this type of relief at other locations? And if you could articulate what that was.
I can.
Yeah, would you like to, yeah. I will say before you step up, I said this is a case of first impression. It's not, of course, really in Illinois. There are municipalities which have been 18 months in on this already, 20 months in on this already. For some of the more politically connected entities that received the early batch of licenses. And they're going through growing pains, right? But much like the growing pains that they went through and we're all going through here in Illinois, when we started out of state in Arizona, very similar, with even less guidance, right? So there were concerns about construction of, is it required that it be a brick structure, right? Or can it be a frame structure that you could potentially kind of cut your way through? How do you handle that kind of thing? We've kind of disposed of those peanut butter issues in terms of development over time. And that leaves us with much of the same, which is zoning questions, placement questions, operational questions, hours of operations, things like that. Illinois is unique in that the state is happy to have the industry and the tax base, but they by virtue of the regulations and the naming and the signage and the appearance and the checks, almost makes it like we want the industry, but we want you to be demure, right? We don't want it to be obvious. So if you were to drive through Colorado, every 57 feet, you will see a cannabis dispensary, and it'll be called Native Roots, or it'll be, and there'll be a cannabis plant or something. All of that kind of stuff that we don't allow here in Illinois. So that's what's unique about it here.
Yeah, and I think you did a good job answering that question, Pat.
Good.
But as far as what I've seen in the past, as far as these type of hearings, like Pat said, it's primarily around educating around, how's this thing going to be built? Is it going to be secured? In the past, they want to know that, there's transparency. The local precinct knows exactly what we're doing. So in the past, that's been part of what I've had to do is notify the police. This is who we are. Here's my phone number. If there's issues, you can call me direct. And so Pat was spot on with just educating on the operation, the staff, just like what we did here, very consistent, and that's.
Maybe I can be a little bit more specific, Mr. Ryan.
Sure.
The application tonight's requiring 3 elements, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a text amendment, there's a conditional use permit, and then there's the variance. And so in your experience with your other locations, have you had to step through those 3 hoops in other locations?
Yes.
Okay. And could you articulate what those other locations are?
What like as far as like
Where they are?
Phoenix, Show Low, Arizona, Portland, Oregon, Albuquerque, New Mexico.
And in each of those examples, did you need to get relief for text amendment, variance, conditional use?
The Phoenix operation, we needed to get a conditional use and a variance, and that was because we were within the buffer zone of another marijuana facility.
Right.
We were able to successfully overcome that because at the end of the day, the city actually wanted they wanted these type of facilities in a similar zone, and so we were able to overturn that.
That's a good segue, Mr. Ryan, because I think Mr. Nats was starting to go down this path, and I'll follow it. During your due diligence, and Mr. Smith was speaking this in his initial comments, there's obviously areas within the community that allow you to potentially, wouldn't have to talk to us at all. You could put your business there. So did you have any opportunity to review other locations? I know Mr. Smith was very articulate about the reasons why you didn't, but did you review any other locations?
Yeah, I looked at quite a few locations, yeah.
And could you explain to the committee which ones you looked at?
Well, I got numerous packet from broker that had available real estate and kind of went down the list. But to kind of reiterate and probably elaborate a little bit from what Pat was saying, when push comes to shove and you start getting into, I think we looked at honestly over 80 different buildings. That's not to say these were pre-vetted and these fit within the confines, but when I started going into it, they started getting narrowed off the list real quick. If they weren't owned outright, and they, that was off the table. They couldn't have a mortgage because mortgage company's not going to let a cannabis business come in. So that narrowed down a substantial amount. Once you got into the setbacks, that was another, major elimination factor. And so push came to shove, and this particular building just fit the bill.
So could you articulate on that last piece for the committee, how did you end up on this location? Why this location versus pick one other spot?
Well, this location also has an economic factor that was feasible for my particular group to entertain. That was more so than the other buildings that we were looking at that would potentially require us to come up with $1 million to purchase. And so that was a factor that influenced our decision. As you guys, like I mentioned earlier, we've been in a landscape in Illinois that's been very challenging. There's been a substantial amount of litigation that has prolonged out these timelines in a manner that has made it tough to just go and wheel and deal with any particular landlord to get a deal done. This particular situation lent itself favorably in a landscape that is kind of difficult to navigate. So we decided to give our best effort attempt at getting authorization on this particular building.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that in the testimony that I'm being accurate, that there were no other offers made by your company to any other facility except this one?
In this community, that is correct.
Okay, thank you. And we do have a gentleman here that actually is a traffic expert, but he didn't ask any questions, so I think the way we began tonight with Mr. Jasper, that there does seem to be some concerns around the traffic, and we all live in the community. So I was wondering if someone could step through the traffic study. I don't know who the expert's going to be there, to help us understand how, what we were talking about earlier, for example, coming out of the facility and taking a left,
Yep.
or coming into the facility and going left, how that was derived. I'd be interested to understand that further.
Sure. Pat, I'll let you speak to the conclusion of the traffic study.
And I would actually just like to clarify, when Anthony said, because I was involved in some due diligence review with them, when he said that there were 80 separate sites, that was not specific to Cary. There was a Route 14 and Route 12 corridor examination, so that encompassed all of those areas down there. Perhaps, because I'm not an engineer myself, and as a result, I'm going to be considered a little mentally deficient when it comes to engineering matters, and I know this because I've been told that by engineers. Is there a specific question, because I'm not qualified as not an engineer to walk through the study, but if there's a particular pull-out question that you have, because we did examine it, we did discuss with them, we discussed with staff, and then we went back and discussed the staff concerns with computations and measurements and timing for them. So I'm familiar with it, and I certainly can speak to all of that without necessarily being.
Where I was with this, Mr. Smith, is that, we just use the hours that were proposed. I can see at the end of the day, we'll call it the 5 o'clock hour, people coming back in through Fox River Grove, for example, and they're going to take a left into your establishment. I can see traffic being problematic, taking that left into the property. And so I would assume, but I don't know, because I don't visit these establishments, that when people are coming home, they might be going to purchase. And that component, along with the parking component, I know you said you're making arrangements with the facility next door to reach a memorandum of understanding with them. But I'm really concerned about the safety component of the traffic and someone taking a left-hand turn coming in from Fox River Grove into the facility, and how the traffic study arrived at that destination. It's confusing to me.
Sure, absolutely. So, of course, they did because it's state highway, they had access to pretty detailed and accurate car counts, and calculated out what the incidence of left-hand turns during the peak hours would be, and concluded that based on that and calculated and in some cases professionally estimated delay times would not be an impediment to the flow of traffic or create a safety risk which was beyond the threshold of the state's variations for safety risks. I will say that at any one time, this property has been used in the last 25 years as a pretty active real estate office at one time, 40 or 50 agents there with their customers, certainly, before the internet took over the industry. And although there has been accidents in that three-way kind of, let's say, intersection there, the rate of them does not appear to be, at least at the surface level that I can see, the rate does not appear to be more significant than at other intersections in the village. So I do hear what you're saying, which is the layout is strange and it seems like it would lend itself to accidents. But statistically, or at least ordinally, based on what we know from the village and from the state, that hasn't happened. So I'm a little hesitant to say the engineers have it wrong, and I'm going to go on anecdotal gut on that, particularly if there's no historical precedence for it.
And along the same line that I was going to ask Mr. Ryan, but you were talking about this earlier, I won't pretend to know. You said you went over to Rise. I have not even been there
Sure.
either. Someone told me it was a church. So.
You see what I'm saying? I thought it was a
Yeah,
breakfast. It looks like
yeah.
a breakfast place. Yeah. Yeah.
What I was going to ask, though, is that there's obviously volumes of people going to these establishments. And so I won't pretend to know if it's 1 an hour, 10 an hour. The gentleman here has some exposure to running other businesses. And so I'm assuming there's peak hours. And I won't pretend to understand, but that's really what's making me stop and pause on the traffic piece, is that I'm assuming at certain times of the day, and 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, is kind of where I'm thinking is your heavier traffic, and what does that look like? And I'm assuming there's some experience with that from your other locations.
Well, I suppose, and we can have Anthony answer that, but this is a unique, from the plans that we had in other locations, it's kind of a unique layout with, let's say, the three-way merge and a driveway right there. I mean, make no mistake about it, with the curve of the road, this property, the properties next door, even the dental office, wouldn't have driveways if they were vacant land right now under the IDOT standards as they exist today, right? Because of sight lines, because of minimum separation distances. All of this existed before the highway and before the stoplight, right? So it's a unique situation. I'm not even really certain that any of the other sites would inform an answer on how that challenge compares up. What I will say is this. We acknowledge that we're asking for a conditional use permit, and by definition, that means that there are going to be conditions, right? And we acknowledge that there may be an amendment today that says the conditional use is recommended with this additional condition. While it is not our preference, if there are hours where left in is not allowed because we don't know yet, right? If it's going to be a safety issue, but we viscerally feel like it might be, then that certainly is something, that we acknowledge. This commission has every right to say, 4 to 6 p.m., no left in, or however that would come up.
May I just follow up on your question? I think the question was peak hours of business, not just the traffic movement itself. Based on your experience, what are your peak hours of business, Monday through Friday, Saturday, Sunday?
Well, I'm actually going to let you answer that question because there are very specific peak hours for these operators.
So as far as peak hours, typically you're going to see that between 7 and probably 9 p.m. and primarily coming up to the weekend. So Friday, Saturday type of timetable. That's really what you're going to see your peak zone.
What are the second busiest times? During the day, I think, is maybe what we're looking for. What is the peak usage during the day once you open at 10 o'clock to 5 or 6 o'clock?
During the week, you're going to see, like I said, I mean, during the week, you're not going to really have that big peak, Monday through Friday, you're not going to have that big peak wave in the middle of the day. You're going to have customers come in throughout the day, but as far as like that peak, that wave, that's, from my experience, tends to revolve around coming up to the weekend, not necessarily, Monday through Thursday.
I've heard other operators indicate the middle of the day, around the noon hour. I don't know if that's been your experience or not.
During the week, not so much a big noticeable peak, at least from my past experience.
All right.
Real quick, as far as the concern about the traffic pattern, and as a part of the community, I definitely obviously want the most safe incoming, outgoing traffic. I felt a little bit more rest assured knowing that at least we got the blessings of the traffic study, and then also hearing earlier today that I believe the police and possibly the community traffic representative also didn't have an objection to the traffic pattern, and so that made me feel a little bit better about that concern, because as we all shared, that is a busy area. But that's all from me.
And just to highlight out of the report, the PM peak for the roadway or for the operation here is projected to be 4:30 to 5:30 weekday evening. And that left turn movement, according to the report, identifies about 27 vehicles turning into the property during that hour. So that's basically one vehicle every 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Simmons. So, gentlemen, other questions for the petitioner? Mr. Kirschman?
Yeah, I mean, it's just back to the traffic again. I was there once when it was a real estate a few years back, and I turned left out of there, and that was one of the scariest things ever, just getting out of that. With cars, they just go flying around that curve. It may be 35, but it doesn't matter. They're always going so fast. So I don't know if there's a way you can do like a right in, right out. Just because it's going to be a lot more than what it's been. When it opens up, I know my daughter's 21. She's all excited, and a lot of her friends are too. And I know what it's going to be like.
And we're receptive to it. At the end of the day, I do personally like to rely on the people that are specialists and know more than me. So, we are receptive to it. If we didn't have to do it, that'd probably be something that our group would be more favorable. But if that's something that, is make or break, that's definitely something we'll consider.
Other questions, gentlemen? Mr. Euler, did you have?
Just a few quick questions.
Go ahead.
We make a record here that moves on to the Board of Trustees.
Okay.
So if we have all the information we can gather here in one place at one time, it can be helpful for the board. So you described your security system a couple times. You mentioned certain aspects of the system. So do you have an individual person on site 24 hours a day?
That's correct.
Okay, and how does that person secure the building?
Well, it is not-
Inside the building, outside the building?
So it is, I should back up because it makes it sound like it's the same person that's there for 24 hours. It is not the same person. It is contracted security because, of course, you need to be licensed in the state of Illinois for that. And so they are, during operational hours, always inside the building. And I believe off hours, they are in the segregated portion, which is the security office portion of the facility. Now, they can leave and come and go, but the biometric security doesn't allow them to get beyond that unless there's a triggering event.
All right, inside the facility, can you briefly describe it as an Apple store? That's a beautiful visual, a nice word picture. How does the inside of the store work? How does the merchandise set up? How is it it wrapped, maintained, advertised inside the facility? Is it in enclosed cases? And then the last thing is, where is the individual that takes the cash? Are they behind a secured area?
Yeah, would you, because I don't have my glasses, so I can't actually read the.
So Illinois was very explicit as far as how this layout needs to take place. So there can't be any product that's accessible to the customer. So like Pat said, when they come in, they're in a restricted area zone until they get a one-on-one employee to take them back into the sales floor. Once they're on that sales floor, all the product is going to be located behind the retail display case in a inventory room that's locked. As far as that education process, there's typically like blanks that people can look at without the product in it, and/or digital displays, so like iPads, basically, where you can take them through, place the order, get queued up, come from a restricted access behind the counter. As far as cash goes, it's taken from behind the counter, put into the register, and closed out like any other retail business at the end of the day.
And where's the product stored at night?
The inventory control room, which is behind the display case in a restricted access zone that only identified employees have in restricted access, a particular employee has access to.
So the jump, looking at the floor plan that's displayed
Oh,
on the screen
sure.
then. So you have, this is the waiting area, as
Yeah.
somebody walks into the building.
So if
this
you go
side.
straight back, all the way back, keep going, that's the display case there, so customers won't go, that's where employees will be. And the secured inventory room will be in the, I think we got that in the back right part of the, yeah.
Inventory vault.
Yep.
So you mentioned you have multiple facilities in multiple jurisdictions.
Yes.
Have you ever had law enforcement involved with any of your facilities, or security that is provided, or any other involvement of law enforcement?
At a very nominal level, we had a homeless person breach one of our security fences, followed a car in, and my security guard intercepted him, and ended up having to call the police to basically give him a formal trespassing notice, because I guess he had been in the area. But as far as like these type of hearings, annually, I have to basically do a checkup where they verify any 911 calls, any police interactions, and I have not had any issues.
Okay. The video surveillance must be ongoing during the operation of the
24/7, yep,
of
and
the
archived,
facility.
yes.
It's 24 hours?
24/7 video surveillance,
All right,
yes.
so where's the surveillance on the outside of the facility? Is there any?
Yes, absolutely, yep, the whole
And-
perimeter,
And inside?
yes.
All right, and then how do you ensure during the operations, during the actual 10 to 10 operations, that the video surveillance is active, that it's operational?
So those DVRs have both audio and visual signals if there were to be a power failure, if there were to be something that cut out, and then also the state regulations, when they come in and do their spot check, they will check that in the event that something were to be not working. You've got that audio-visual signal, and then also those are being archived. I believe the mandate in Illinois is for it's pretty substantial. I think it's like 90 days where that you got a backup, which is a substantial amount of data.
All right, any way to see into the interior from the outside?
No.
Okay. And you have an ancillary use that
Yep.
you've requested that you're approved for
Yep.
through the state
Sure.
to infuse product.
Yes.
So how does that operate? To what extent are you infusing product on the site? And
Sure.
how does that work on site?
Sure. So don't get too intimidated by the whole infusion concept. The way I was explaining to Pat was it's very much so a small batch boutique type of setup, very much so even less commercial than probably your standard pub with general bar food, because with cannabis, you're not really dealing with any potentially hazardous food, you're not dealing with grease, and so what we're doing is small batch, boutique, high-end, handmade edibles, primarily consisting of like gourmet chocolate that's hand painted with an airbrush, high-end real fruit gummies, hard candies, and just kind of the kind of base staples. And so that is taking place on very basic commercial kitchen type of items. So what I mean by that is we've got a steam hood, we've got a convection oven, we've got 3 induction hot plates, and we got a Hobart mixer and a 3-basin sink and a hand sink. And so this particular kitchen is, the reality is you could probably fit the hardware of that kitchen in a 400 square foot room. It's very small, 2 employees, and that's the intention.
You mentioned 10 to 15 employees potentially?
Oh, that's actually the 2 that we're going to be for the infusion was built into the total number.
So what typically are the ages of those employees? What kind of training do they have to have, if any?
I can speak
And what
to
kind
that.
of training do you provide?
Sure. So in Illinois, you have to be 21. You have to go through, obviously, your credentialed background check, make sure you're not having excluded felonies or whatnot. Apart from that, you need to get your state agent card, which requires you to do a pretty base, high-level training. Apart from that, we've got substantial training, both hands-on, on-site, as well as our SOPs. Very detailed, thought out, every process that you could possibly be taken care of within that environment is going to be detailed.
All right, last question.
Sure.
You run a number of facilities.
Yep.
Have you ever had any issues with employees relative to drug use, impairment on the job, and how do
Sure.
you deal with that?
That's a good question. It's always got to be on the forefront. I mean, you're running a cannabis business, so in a lot of cases, you may have employees that are consumers, and so with that, you've got to have very strict protocols as far as not only no consumption on premise, but also not to be intoxicated at work. Part of that is, protocols that come into play from, people aren't allowed to bring their backpacks into work. You're not allowed to loiter. You're not allowed to hang out in your car. And having 24/7 monitors, having on-site security, having strong managers and directors, that's always something that you're keeping an eye on, and it's a no-go as far as, drug use.
Thank you, Mr. Euler.
Real quick, and to that point, if there is a situation where you think somebody has been using drugs or intoxicated on work, I always have my employee manual where people sign off, where if I have that feeling, you have to go get a drug test. And if you don't, well, then we have grounds to terminate.
So other questions, gentlemen? So, gentlemen, this is the time where I open it up to public comment, and as you all know, there is no one really assembled here beside the petitioner and their attorney. So unless you gentlemen have public comment, I'm going to close the public comment of the meeting. And so I think we're going to close this part of the meeting also, Mr. Ryan. And now we'll kind of bring it back here in-house. And so, gentlemen, before I call the motion, I want to see if there's other questions you have amongst yourselves about the petition.
None from my end.
I think everything's.
So I do have a question for Mr. Simmons, actually. So, I think the fact that cannabis is legal in the state of Illinois, this is probably not going to be the first application we're going to see at this committee, especially in the other places where it's allowed, so it theoretically doesn't come to this committee. But if someone were to come to you tomorrow and wanted to put in a cannabis dispensary with infusion, where could they go right now today? Do you know of any locations?
So it would relate back to.
What's available?
Correct. And as the petitioner mentioned, some of the market conditions that are out there that may restrict it. Obviously, our code does allow it within the areas that are not covered in yellow, that are colored on the B2, B3, or M districts on this map. So there are properties that are zoned appropriately for the use, that the use could go in legally by right. Today wouldn't require going through a public hearing for approval as long as they met the conditions of the ordinances. But the market conditions that exist as far as the specific properties that are within those districts may restrict the ability for a use to go in those facilities as of there today.
Sure. All right, so, Mr. Williams?
With it being somewhat close to the R2A, was there any consideration for like a crosswalk, or is there, I don't, off the top of my head, don't know if there's one by that park, but was there any consideration of people walking and or riding bikes, not just traveling by automobile to it, because it's.
There's a sidewalk.
Yeah.
There is a sidewalk, but I mean, like, if they're crossing 14, where would they cross?
CBS.
Yeah, I believe the intersection at East Main and 14, there is a pedestrian crossing signal at
Okay,
that
I
intersection.
just can't, in my mind, I didn't. look
Yeah,
at-
North to south, there is one at First Street.
Correct, yeah, I know there's one up there.
right. I'm not sure, I think there are across, I'm just seeing if I have an aerial that shows it.
I was just thinking about where that driveway, that, whatever that driveway is, or long driveway, like,
I think when we did the sidewalk improvement, that there was a gap that basically was just west of this property from the downtown into where the Burger King location was at. The village constructed that sidewalk to complete that gap. So there's a sidewalk now that goes all the way from essentially the Burger King property to the downtown area. And I can't recall if there is a crosswalk that goes across 14. I want to say, I think as part of the project that there was an improvement there, but off the top of my head, I can't
There's,
verify for sure.
we talking about at East Main Street?
yeah.
Correct.
Yep.
There's no
Yeah.
crosswalk.
There's no crosswalk there?
Yeah.
Okay.
I live over there.
I figured you did.
There's no pedestrian signal there. Obviously, the signal the traffic signal exists, so somebody
Right.
still could cross the street in that location, but there might not be a designated pedestrian crosswalk.
All right, gentlemen, other questions? If there's no other questions, I'm probably going to call a motion. Go ahead, Mr.
I
Johnson.
do have one more question.
Sure.
And it's futuristic, but, you know, we just left the traffic as is by the fact that we've done the study, we've talked to the city staff that are, you know, professionals at it and so on and so forth, and we just agreed to go with it the way that it is. But then all of a sudden, we find out that I think that there were like 4 accidents over a year or whatever, and it turns into 20. Does the village have the capability of going back to the business and saying, you know, we've got, for community safety, we've got to change this? Is there, you know, what can be done if we find out we're wrong about this?
Sure, I think if there is a traffic safety concern that develops out of a use, obviously, it's a road that way that's under IDOT jurisdiction, so traffic safety concern develops, we certainly can work with the agency as far as correcting the issue. There are, you know, various standards that are, from a traffic engineering standpoint, the manual uniform traffic control devices. So if you see that the turning movements going into the property are delaying through movements through the intersection, or causing more rear-end connection crashes during specific time periods, we can do a traffic study to evaluate that and determine if additional restrictions need to be put in place. And if that's a concern of the board here as well, that could be something that we add as a condition to the approvals for the conditional use, to say that we may revisit that operation of that driveway after a year of operation to verify that there is no adverse impacts from this business location.
Okay.
I have a clarification question.
Yeah.
I believe there was a comment earlier that the traffic study projected, this is a question, did the traffic study project during the hours of 4:30 to 5:30 that there would be one left-hand turn every 2 minutes?
Every 2 to 3?
Yeah, according to the study, there's 27 left turn movements into the property during that peak hour. So essentially, it's 2 movements per every 2 minutes, or a movement every 2 minutes for that hour time. So there might be a 5-minute period where it might have, you know, 4 cars that turn in and then 10 minutes where
So-
there's nothing, but it averaged out for that hour.
So it's going on now. It's not something that we think might happen because we opened this business in it today, or when it was a real estate office, or whenever this was done, where we actually have those movements without the accidents that we're concerned about.
Is that a true statement, or was it based on
You want to
actual
repeat
traffic
that,
data?
Pat?
Yeah.
I didn't get what you were saying.
He said that people are turning left now.
Right.
Yeah, but not 27 an hour.
Well, there's no business there now, right?
Well, there is, but I don't know what the, you know, the
I
volume.
think what he was asking, Jim, is this projected, or is this current or past use?
It's projected.
It's
It's
projected.
total traffic.
That's
an important
Okay.
That's an important distinction.
Okay.
Just since we're addressing crashes and that, besides the fact that they have a typo in the crash summary, 5-year, 21 accidents, which also includes the intersection of East Main Street and 14. According to the data they have, there was only one accident in 5 years at that driveway.
Right.
One turning accident. So, sure, we're probably going to get more. Personally, again, I would like to see the left turns restricted, the inbound left turns restricted, even if it's just during that PM peak hour. Obviously, they're not open during the AM peak, so we don't care about that. But that's I don't necessarily want to make that a condition, but I want to make that something that we should be aware of in the future, that might be something we want to consider.
Yeah. Well, I feel better knowing that we can revisit, the village can revisit this.
The village, under existing codes and that, can revisit any intersection at any time, get a request for a four-way stop at some residential thing, they react to it. They go out and make some counts. Be the same thing, only this would be the village reacting to a condition.
And that's why I'm a little more comfortable with the output of the report.
But you'd like the ability potentially, if I understand your question, to adjust curbing on site if we need to address this use in the event that it's having an impact on its own. And there's something that might be done on site? Is that what you're asking?
No, I'm just,
Is that what
Chris?
you were asking? Yeah.
I-
Regarding a condition?
Can you state that again?
Well, if there's a question about addressing a potential traffic issue at this site that is unique to the site or that can be rectified or remedied by adjusting something on site, we'd want to do that with the special use, as Brian indicated.
Yes.
Review this in a year and make judgments about whether or not there is an issue that needs to be addressed. If it's the road, you're right, the road is an issue that's to be addressed by the village at any point in time based on a problem.
So gentlemen, how about this? How about if I call the motion? If you want to make some adjustments to the motion, we can debate that a little bit further. Is that acceptable to you, men? All right.
Why don't you do the amendment first, and then we can talk about conditions.
Yeah, so I think you want to do text first, Jim?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the chair will entertain a motion to recommend to the Village Board of Trustees approval of a text amendment to Chapter 2 zoning districts to allow cannabis dispensaries with ancillary infusion as a conditional use within the B3R district as detailed within the staff report.
So moved.
Second.
I'm not, stereo.
He beat me.
All right, so did anybody want to change anything on that? I think that's pretty straightforward information. So, Mr. Simmons, would you call the roll?
Sure. O'Laughlin?
Yes.
Nats?
No.
Jasper?
yes,
Graziano?
Yes.
Kretschmer?
Yes.
Williams?
Yes.
Corey?
No. Okay, now, the chair will entertain a motion to recommend to the Village Board of Trustees approval of a conditional use for a cannabis dispensary with ancillary infusion in a variance to the cannabis land using screening requirements along the southern property line for the property located at 20 Northwest Highway, subject to the conditions listed in the staff report.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, gentlemen.
What were the, I didn't see any
Can you put it back on the
conditions.
screen? Or-
I don't have them in the screen, but I can read them. So there's 6 conditions that are on page 10 of the staff report.
How did I miss that?
You're going back.
Oh, I'm in the wrong section, that's why.
So the first condition is the conditional use for the dispensary will be granted to Vertical Management LLC
Oh,
for the
okay.
property,
Yeah.
20 Northwest Highway.
Never mind.
Number 2 is the use shall conform to the requirements of section 14.3.11 of the UDO as they pertain to a cannabis dispensary. Condition 3 is the proposed improvements shall substantially conform to the attached plans and exhibits as part of this petition, except as they may be changed to conform to state and village codes and all conditions of approval. Condition 4 is a 6-foot privacy fence shall be installed along the southern property line shared with the adjacent single-family detached residences. In addition to the fencing, screening vegetation shall be planted and maintained to provide additional screening of the parking lot area. Condition 5 is a copy of the State of Illinois license for the business shall be furnished to the Community Development Department upon receipt. And if the license is revoked, suspended, or otherwise modified for any reason by the State of Illinois, the petitioner shall notify the Village of Cary as to the license's change in status. And the 6th condition is proposed is to, prior to the issuance of a certificate of occupancy, the petitioner shall coordinate with the police department on security plans for the facility and coordinate efforts to respond to any potential incidents that may occur on the property.
Everybody good there? Yeah. Okay, does anybody want any modification to those conditions, or are we comfortable?
Just explanation of how number 4 condition relates to the variance we're going to talk about next.
Yeah, so that condition would be, the condition, the 6-foot privacy fence and the landscaping would essentially align with the proposed landscape plan as proposed. So,
Okay, well,
We're doing
let's
it twice, but.
let's do this, and I can ask my question again when we're talking about the variance.
It's conditional use and a variance for a fence.
right.
Yeah.
You're doubling down on a fence, just relax.
So that
Why?
becomes,
Because it's 6 foot?
Because it's 6 foot.
that's the question. So is the way the motion is presented in the staff report is would be voting on both the conditional use and the variance at the same time?
Correct.
So those conditions would apply towards the approval of both of those.
So is this
requests.
incorporating the variance?
Correct.
Oh, that was the simple answer.
Yes.
Number 4 is the variance.
Right.
See, that was the answer I was looking for. Okay,
Good. All right. So unless there's any other comments or input, I'm going to ask Mr. Simmons to,
This question would be, is there a desire for the board to add a condition that the entrance be studied a year after the business operates to verify there's no traffic safety concerns that develop in the business?
Yes.
okay, so I want to make sure who supported the motion, because we're going to have to ask them to modify.
It was Mr. Laughlin, Mr. Williams, first and second.
Okay, so Frank, are you going to be comfortable with that?
I'm okay with that.
And then Mr. Williams? Okay.
So we'll add a condition that basically states a year after the business begins operations that will,
do we want to put a date on it, or do we want to just say if conditions arise? 'Cause
It changes a
in
certain
6
percentage,
months,
or, I mean, what?
If we've got an accident problem there, we want to take care of it, we don't want to wait for a year.
sure.
Why put a timeframe on it?
That's what Jim's saying.
Yeah.
Annual review? Quarterly review? 6 months
Yeah,
review?
just, should a accident concern arise, the village will study and possibly make recommendations for modification of the access requirements.
How do we define an accident problem?
That was good, Jim. I like that.
Purposely vague.
I think the essence is to have some type of review on some kind of regular basis to be defined by us of what that looks like in this revised
Well,
motion.
what are we, burning minutes here, but what are we really, I mean, are we asking to do something that IDOT and the Village of Cary can do anyway without this regulation, or are we?
I'm here to tell you, IDOT won't do it.
But Kerry might.
Carrie,
But
Cary might.
Cary could.
yeah,
Without
without adding it. to it.
adding this, without, we're not doing anything, we're not making any changes, we're not holding the petitioner to anything by having this on the approval.
No, no. We're holding
So
ourselves.
it's,
to
so it's
it.
already there, so we're just being redundant.
Yeah.
Right,
It would-
just as we are in many of our conditions.
But I just want to be clear, Mr. Jasper, that we're not talking about right in, right out, or anything like that. We're just talking about the ability, and we can rescind this if the village decides they want to review it themselves, and I think we said they can.
Yeah.
So now we're back to where we started. So if you want to rescind it, Mr. O'Laughlin, and Mr. Williams wants to rescind it, that's a different discussion.
It's certainly, having the condition in the approvals gives it more teeth for the village if there is an issue that we can revert back to the ordinance that approved the use, that if, should there be an issue that needs to be addressed, the petitioner has to sign off on all those conditions of approval. So it's a year down the line or 5 years down the line, if there becomes a traffic issue, concern with that intersection, it does allow us the ability to.
That ability's still there.
Correct.
I mean,
But there's less, I guess, I'll say there's less ability for the property owner to
Dispute.
disagree with something, should you need to do something there. It may streamline it a little bit more.
Right, if we're asking the owners of the property to be part of the solution, that their property's involved, they somehow are involved with access in and out or the orientation of traffic, we want to include it in the ordinance.
Right.
Is it-
we leave it.
All right, so
Is this something that could be a precedent setting with new businesses, us doing this? Has this been done before?
we're just putting a condition on this one, that's
It's
all.
Right.
been conditions on
Okay.
ordinances before.
I'm just thinking of new businesses that are coming, and we're going to set this, is that something that obviously moving forward, they might consider, oh, well, this happened last time, just,
Yeah, there's similar conditions that we've approved in the last, 5 years for parking, variances that were
Right.
approved. So similar type, yeah.
yeah, I'm good with it.
Just very similar discussion of the bank property at West Main Street and 14.
Yeah, and I'm sure everyone wants to do the right thing. I mean, no one's going to be on the hook and say, well, I want to continue having these bad intersections, right? I mean, that's not going to be something, so I'm good keeping it.
Yeah, I'm good keeping.
All right,
Is it appropriate to ask for a clarification? Because I think I've lost something.
He's going to review it, yeah.
yeah, so just so we're clear on what we just went through, gentlemen, and for the entire group, we called the motion, we added an amendment to the motion that would talk about some type of review of the traffic in the event that there were accidents, so that we had the capability to review on some type of basis. I don't know if it's per annum, if we've gotten that specific, but gives the
No.
village the opportunity
Just-
to review any accidents that may or may not occur at that
Yeah, I think
location.
the clarification was more of a language one, right? So the question is, from a use perspective, then what, right? So let's say there's some accidents and the village determines they'd like to evaluate. Is the evaluation result limited to adjusting traffic access patterns? Or is it, in the law of unintended consequences, potentially fatal to the conditional use of the property? Because then it's kind of hard to get a landlord to put a few $100,000 into improvements if 9 months from now, say, I don't like the traffic patterns, you can't maintain the conditional use. And I don't think the language was clear enough for me to feel confident that we were talking about the former and not the latter. So I'm wondering if maybe the language could be read back so that I have a better understanding of that.
Yeah, I think what we were going for wasn't that it would be fatal to the conditional use. It would be,
Subject to review.
it would be a review of traffic patterns
For
and maybe,
access
okay, you
purposes.
know what? We've had 10 accidents here in 3 months. We've got to go to right in, right out.
Thank you.
It's just got to happen. That's my understanding of what we're.
That's how I
what we're
thought it
going
too.
for here.
That's what I agreed to.
Well, go ahead.
The point is, okay, so we get to that point and we make that determination. And if the petitioner wants to dispute it, doesn't think that it's, his question is, do they lose the conditional use because they're not going along with it?
Potentially, yes. So the condition would be to address, if your site, if traffic coming to and from your site, the problem is uniquely and specifically attributable to your site and your traffic, yes, we would be looking at the traffic patterns and how to best address those with changes that could be made on your site. We're not asking you to make changes in the roadway. Those are general changes for the public. But there may be some site-specific change or adjustment based on what is being generated by your business.
No, I appreciate that, thank you. I think my concern grew out of the fact that, as we're sitting here, I think we all agree that that makes a lot of sense. But the land use recommendation that's going to the village board is almost entirely without definable standard. And so 4 years from now, when many of us might not even be involved in this process, what is the standard of review? And who, we say the village, but if the village says, one accident is too many, you can't, these are gonna be your hours. That's not commercially reasonable, but this is a function of our conditional use. And so commercial reasonability doesn't come into play, whereas under your enforcement as it exists today, you do have to balance and weigh, right? the property use rights. So in a sense, I kind of feel like what you have gives us more, us as a property owner and user, gives us some certainty about what the standards and our rights and remedies, and frankly, your rights are, than to say it'll be reviewed and potentially, if you don't agree that our analysis is correct, your conditional use could go away at any time. It's kind of like a sword hanging over that.
So let me ask the question a different way, Mr. Smith. I understand your concern. I'll ask Mr. Simmons for this. Let's assume this gets approved in Blue Sky World, and it's a year from now, and we discover that in the course of 1 month, there's 10 accidents. It's the left coming in.
Sure.
Make believe this amendment we just proposed gets wiped out. What would the village do, Mr. Simmons?
So for any sort of traffic control device that gets installed, so say it's a left turn in restriction, there will need to be a traffic study or analysis that needs to be performed to determine if that sign or that restriction meets various warrants for the installation of a traffic control device. So it's basically manual uniform traffic control devices has certain requirements or standards for the installation of four-way stop, of traffic signal, various restrictions such as this. So if we determine via a study or analyzing the data that would occur after the year after opening, if we observe that there are 10 accidents, as an example, and they're all occurring that peak hour, 4:30 to 5:30 p.m., that, based on the manual traffic control devices, we can determine that that's the time period that there's an issue out here. The rest of the day it may be operating perfectly fine. So that would warrant or meet the warrants for providing a restriction into the site at that time period. So we could say the rest of the time full access is fine, but this specific hour we want to restrict your left turn movements in maybe 4 to 6 or whatever that time period would be. But basically we have to see that there's data that would support that.
So the village could do that at their own volition, I guess, is the.
And expense,
Yeah.
traffic study.
Right. And I think to respond to the position's concern, I think kind of the way that I might draft that condition would be, should an accident concern occur to the area as a response, as in relation to the proposed use, the village may study potential reasonable restrictions on traffic movements or within the site, subject to completion of a traffic engineering study.
Which, yeah, I think that helps at least define the parameters subject to the study, although I do then think now you're really, really kind of just restating what the process would already be, but I think that makes sense.
We're looking at a risk that exceeds the ordinary and expected
Sure.
risk for any similar use, comparable use on the roadway.
I wouldn't presume to speak entirely for my clients, but I assume they want their customers to be safe too, and
Yeah.
for people to feel safe.
Well,
going into it.
I believe you know, through your own admission, you understandably disclaimed your lack of familiarity with traffic studies, and oftentimes the traffic.
Here who is an expert, that is
Yeah.
correct.
Oftentimes, the traffic study consulting firms are present at these meetings so that we're able to ask more detailed questions and get more detailed professional responses. So in the event that we don't have that firm here to give us those detailed responses, we have to address this concern in another way. And I would just observe that the projected, this would be a question I would have for the traffic engineer to say, on what basis did you conclude that there would be 27 left-hand turns within the peak hours of 4:30 to 5:30? But we can't get a professional response. It's feasible, therefore, that your patronage might either increase or decrease. Should it increase and triple over the course of the next few months or the course of the next few years, that's going to exacerbate potentiality for issues.
So we've bent the rules here, as you can see, Mr. Smith. Normally, we wouldn't, yeah, no, look, we're an open-minded group here, and we want to make, this is kind of the first time for us, too, on this petition, so we're trying to meet the middle ground here. So, gentlemen, I want to make sure that we're clear now on what Mr. Simmons said, the concerns the petitioner has, and that we're still comfortable keeping this in, and if we're comfortable keeping it in, I'm going to ask Mr. Simmons to repeat what he said. You obviously have the motion. We modified it, Mr. O'Laughlin agreed. Mr. Williams agreed. I want to make sure we still agree, but I'm going to ask Mr. Simmons to reread what he just stated.
So, as I've drafted here, so shouldn't an accident issue, sorry, going through my words here again.
Take your time. Take your time.
While he's looking at that, is this a unique motion, or is this tied to the variance
It's-
for the screening and the,
It's one and the same now. We're just adding on some language.
to the
Yeah, the
motion
variance
for
and
the
conditional
screening
use.
requirement?
Right. We're
Well, no,
just-
both. We're doing both.
Yeah, we're
So
doing.
we're doing
there's
2 and
motions.
3.
We approved one, and now we're on to the second one.
So
Moving to
what
it.
this would essentially be for Mr. Nance, this would be condition 7
Right.
of the conditions for approval for the conditional use and the variance.
6, we're adding 7.
So what I have is, should an accident issue or concern develop to the area due to the operation of the proposed use, the village will study potential reasonable restrictions on traffic movements or within the site, subject to completion of a traffic engineering study.
Could you read that one more time?
Should an accident issue or concern develop to the area due to the proposed use or the operation of the proposed use, the village will study potential reasonable restrictions on traffic movements or within the site, subject to the completion of a traffic engineering study.
How about should a trend of accidents?
Trend?
Well, I would add that at the village's determination.
Well, that's the ones that are gonna, the village is the one that's gonna.
I understand, but
raise-
just for the sake of clarity, can't hurt.
Okay, but if you take a look at this, we take a look at the other 7, they all either address use or they address actions required by conditions that the petitioner has to meet.
And this one
This
doesn't.
8th one is.
7th.
Or 7th one, I'm sorry, the 6th. The 7th one is completely outside the control of the petitioner and
Is
is
some-
not particular to the use.
And it's something the village can do at
And
any
it's something that the
time.
village
Yeah,
can
it's
do on
just a
their own.
safety-
I don't see
Yeah.
how this is.
I think it's redundant, and I think if the village already has the power to do it, why would we set another condition?
Because if
So
it
I-
can't, if it's allowed as a conditional, this is a conditional approval, right? So we have the,
For the use, but this is for the traffic. This is just
Conditions
specific to
required
the
of the
traffic.
petitioner or for the use of the property.
right.
It would be related to the use of the property because it's the traffic generation by the use, that this use is producing traffic that affects the adjacent roadway or the adjacent intersection.
Okay, but the village go through all this and they decide that a change has to be made. Okay? The petitioner doesn't have any recourse to the action that you take. So if you go back to your example and 4:30 to 5:30 is ground zero and, and you say, no left ins, no left outs, 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock. There's nothing that the petitioner can do other than come back to you and say, please don't. They can't come back and sue you, they can't come back and, and there's nothing that they can do that says, we're not gonna live by that, because you're the one putting up the signage, you're the one that's enforcing the traffic. So they're not doing, they have nothing to do in which to make this situation better.
So one way to address that is you amend in the event that there is a traffic study that shows that there is an issue that requires some kind of change at the site, potentially that this commission and the board would be considering, we would reconvene this meeting. You would post a notice of an amendment to the special use. You would hold another hearing of this kind as to that specific issue. You would be at that hearing with us, and we would discuss the information that we have and what may need to be adjusted at the site.
Again, what would be adjusted at the site,
There would be a
not the road, at the site?
Correct. So there'd be a recommendation from this body, the Board of Trustees. Board of Trustees would consider that and either say thumbs up, thumbs down. If it's unreasonable, you have the same option that you have tonight, if you think what the board is doing is unreasonable, to follow it or not follow it, or make proposals at the meeting yourselves.
Again, the problem is the traffic. And anything that the village would decide to change that is not on the property.
Well,
So-
this
so-
only relates to the property, not to the road. This only relates to curbing, access, ingress, egress. on the property.
Ingress and egress would be considered part of the property, condition of the property.
But the village can say without input, no left turn in, no left turn out.
No, we would go back through this process in the event that
But
we.
the village can say that.
Sure.
Yeah.
They can
You
say
could say
that.
it
So it can, and they
Oh, no.
can, and they can enforce it.
No,
At any time.
I don't believe that is the case, that we can require them to create a solution to a problem on their site based on a traffic study that we've done. We can do it on our property.
Well, no, their site ends at the roadway, okay?
Well,
So the person that comes in, when they put those front wheels out over onto the road, they're no longer responsible for them. This
Right.
Village of Cary is.
Right.
And if the Village of Cary says between 4 and 6 o'clock, you can't make a left turn in and you can't make a left turn out, that's not their problem. And there's nothing that we can do within this conditional use that would control them.
Right, so just so we're clear, only if you're talking about addressing it on their site. If the village is going to do it on village property and village right-of-way, that's on the village.
But I
If
think
you're
that's
going
what
to
we are
ask-
addressing.
Okay,
Well, but I'm just saying, if you're asking this user, this property owner, to remain available to address this problem on their site, on their property, with their curbing or their access, then you will need to make it part of this special use,
so what would that be?
this condition that we're talking about.
No.
No,
I was asking, what would you ask them to do?
What would
No,
the
this-
solution
We
be?
don't know.
This has to do with the
this
roadway.
condition is talking about on the right-of-way.
Yep.
Yeah. Right.
If it's on the right of way, then you don't put it in the special use.
Yeah. So there's no
Okay, then
reason, I
take
mean,
it
there's,
out.
there's,
All right, so gentlemen,
Take it
can I
out.
try to bring some closure to this, because I think we're going to beat this up for another 20 minutes. So I think if I heard in the testimony earlier, and Mr. Simmons can repeat it if he wishes, because it was asked and answered, this was reviewed internally by the village, correct?
Jefferson, yes.
Yes. It was agreed to by the village that it was appropriate for the use, correct? All right. So I'll leave it to Mr. O'Loughlin if he wants to withdraw. He
I'll
wants to-
withdraw.
Withdrawn.
Withdrawn. So,
Delete number 7.
all right, so 7 is out. And unless there's any further beating up of the motion, we're going
How
to,
come you guys don't go through all this discussion when I call something redundant?
so Mr. Simmons, you could call the roll on that second motion, please.
Sure. Nats.
No.
Jasper.
yes.
Graziano.
Yes.
Kretschmer.
Yes.
Williams.
Yes.
O'Loughlin.
Yes.
Corey.
No. So, Mr. Smith, Mr. Ryan, you have a favorable recommendation. The way the process works, and I'm sure you're familiar with it by now, Mr. Ryan, is that you stay in close coordination with Mr. Simmons. This will come before the village trustees, and as I mentioned early, they're the final arbiter of our discussion tonight. This is very new to this village. This is the first application, as you know well. So I would suggest talking to Mr. Simmons with some specificity about when that meeting's going to occur. And I think some of the comments that you heard tonight, specifically the traffic engineering study and having a representative from that study available, might serve you well, but I'll leave that to your judgment.
As far as the preliminary date we're looking at, it would be July 19th is the next board meeting that this can go to.
Okay, and speaking of meetings, Mr. Simmons, maybe for the record, is there anything else coming down the pike?
I have one submittal that we received that potentially could be coming forward in July, and I'm anticipating a second submittal as well. So we may have 2 cases for the next meeting in, I forget the date that is, July 10th, I believe this is the date, the
Yeah, I
14th.
think- I think that's correct, so let me just double check for everyone, so it looks like
So-
right here, 14th?
July 14th,
Yes, very good.
So we likely will have a meeting that
Can we all agree if Jim brings up the word redundant, we can discuss it?
And this particular this goes to the village board on July 18th, you said?
The 19th would be
19th.
the next date, so.
All right, gentlemen, before we adjourn, any other questions, comments? So I'll thank you very much for your focus tonight, gentlemen, everyone's questions. To the petitioner, thank you for your presentation. We'll wish you success in your next meeting. And with that, Chair will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Got it.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you.